We're welcoming today Michael Hopkins, who's the CEO and chairman of MHC International in London and Geneva. It's a research and service company specializing in social development issues for public and private sectors. He's also the professor of corporate responsibility and business performance at Middlesex University Business School, where he founded and chairs the International Center for Corporate Responsibility and Business Performance. His latest book is Corporate Social Responsibility and International Development, released by EarthScan in 2006. Thank you very much for joining us here today at the George Washington University Center for International Business Education and Research. Our center's unifying theme is institutions and development, and through our work we seek to understand how businesses can be more competitive in a global context that fosters greater economic and social development. So as you can see, your life's work is of great interest to us here at the GW-CIBER. I thought we would start by asking a couple of sort of general questions that relate to the topic of your book today, Michael. And perhaps we could start by asking, what are some of the specific social problems or needs that businesses you believe are uniquely suited to solve or fulfill in developing countries?
I don't think that businesses are unique to solve problems, but I think they can contribute quite a lot to solve social problems. Of course, to be a good business person, you have to be a very good manager. And so you need very, very good skills, very good management skills. And one can see that lots of social problems are a result of poor governance, which is in a sense is poor management. So I think that corporations, the big ones, can make a big contribution to management and transferring skills.
Terrific. Do you notice that in your work that some of the more traditional actors that we associate with development work, for instance the multilaterals, some of the NGOs, even government agencies, are deficient in some of these management practices? And if so, could you perhaps give us some examples that might illustrate this?
Unfortunately, this is the case, is that our multilateral organizations have been going, since the Second World War, and have a lot of problems, a lot of management problems. You know, what can they do in the future? Well, who knows? The United Nations, for example, has just appointed a new Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon. Now, I described him in an article I wrote for Open Democracy as coming from the automaton school of diplomats. It's not particularly flattering. But the thing is, how does such people get these jobs? I mean, who elected him? So what sort of skills does he bring to this particular job? So the structure of these multilateral organizations seem to have an awful lot of problems. Now, at the moment, he's been in this job 1 month, and already there are criticisms of him in the New York Times, Financial Times, for his staff selection. His number 2, for example, he just appointed a Tanzanian lady, foreign minister, with hardly any experience, almost unknown beforehand. He's just appointed head of the humanitarian section, Sir Holmes, a British. As you can see, I'm British too. But Sir Holmes, in his CV, has absolutely nothing on humanitarian issues. And yet, the person in charge of the political issues, and he's an expert on political issues, is a humanitarian. So what's going on in these organizations? Well, that's one thing. The kind of management is very poor. Second is that these organizations are kind of poor. The United Nations itself, it runs its offices in Geneva, Nairobi, Vienna, and New York, with about $1.5 billion a year, which for you and I is a lot of money. But you know, for an institution, it's peanuts. It's something like 4% of the New York health budget, for goodness sake. So there's certainly a tendency, I think worldwide, but also in this country, in the United States especially, to criticize the United Nations. And I think the image that people have in this country is that the UN consumes 20% of the US budget. Well, in fact, it's absolutely minuscule. And in fact, the US is a very poor payer to the United Nations. So you get all these political problems with the UN. Unfortunately, the United States, which is a great nation, great ideas, great universities such as yours, comes up with the most clownish attitudes to institutional organizations. Well, we know the problem in Iraq, for example. Don't let's get into that. But you know, where was the role of the United States and the UN in Iraq? It was non-existent. And look at the huge problem. Interesting enough, the UN was set up in New York precisely to keep the US involved, because the US has always been isolationist. So the idea was to put the UN in New York in order to keep the US involved. So it's forced to be involved. However, the relations have been very poor. Another interesting quote is that Mayor Giuliani, who's just announced his candidature for president, I think, said when he was mayor of New York, when he first was appointed, that they should turn the UN into a hotel. And his aides pointed out to him that, well, if you turn the UN into a hotel, half of Manhattan would empty, because all the hotels and so on, which are full of delegates to the UN for the conferences and the rest of it. He quickly withdrew that remark. But then it continued. You had John Bolton, the ambassador to the UN. I mean, he was a famously huge critique of the UN. So who are these people? When you're dealing with the UN, you're dealing with 180, 200 countries. Certainly it's a talking shop, but why not? I mean, you need a place where 200 countries can get together and talk with each other. And as anybody knows, even with 3 people to try and get a decision, it's very difficult. With 200 countries, absolutely impossible. So these are some of the problems with the UN. And so in my book, I say that the UN has failed, the UN and its institutions, and I would also include the World Bank in that. The UN and the World Bank, of course, their relationships are rather strange. I mean, the World Bank is part of the UN. You know, the World Bank staff members carry laissez-passers, same with the IMF. But the World Bank regards itself as much superior as the UN. A lot of that is because of the way it operates. In the World Bank, those with most dollars have most power. In the UN, it's one nation, one vote. So in a sense, the World Bank is much more efficient. On the other hand, it's much less liked in developing countries in the UN. And of course, the appointment of the new president, Mr. Wolfowitz, I think was just a huge mistake. The background of Wolfowitz, and as I'm sure your viewers know, was not particularly brilliant. And now here he is leading a major development institution. So, you know, what's happening to our development institutions when we get treated as political footballs? So it seems to me that the UN has failed in so much as how it's been treated by powerful countries and powerful interest groups. I don't think it's going to change very much in the future. I hope it will, but it's pretty under-resourced. And at the same time, big companies are entering into the fray. That the UN, in total development expenditure in a year, something like $20 billion. ExxonMobil just announced profits of $39.6 billion. Of course, well, not all that's going to development, that's for sure. But corporations all around the world are contributing enormous amounts to development. I estimate, it's a real back-of-the-envelope calculation. Perhaps your students can do better and try and make an estimation of how much corporations, big ones, are spending on development and development-related issues. I estimated something like $50, $60 billion a year going in foreign aid from corporations. Very strange.
Terrific. Well, you know, one thing that I'm hoping that you can help us with on the definitional side, you talk about CSR, corporate social responsibility, as being one mechanism through which corporations, large and small, might play an important role in development and relate to this figure that you've given. I wonder if you can help us to understand why there seem to be such vastly different definitions and practices of CSR engagement around the world.
I think corporate social responsibility, as an expression, plays less well in the United States than almost anywhere in the world. The word social somehow is anathema to people in the United States, because it kind of reeks of socialism and not far away communism and the rest of it. So there's always been a bit of a problem. So when you're talking with companies about corporate social responsibility, they say, well, what's all this social stuff? Are you just trying to make us into socialist companies? We don't understand it. So in fact, the term that's used more in the United States tends to be corporate responsibility. Mm-hmm. But it strikes me if you throw out the word social, it's like, to use a horrible expression, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because the whole thing is the social treatment of your various stakeholders. And so that's one thing. Certainly in the United States, there's a great hesitancy to use the word social. Now around the world, you also find lots of definitions of CSR. You find corporate sustainability. You find business ethics. You find corporate citizenship, and so on. There's a whole host of definitions. I think one thing is that corporations kind of like to innovate, and so they're onto the new concept before they finish with the old one. Sometimes the problem with that is that do we know what we're talking about? But so certainly in Europe, maybe the rest of the world, where they're not so frightened of the word social, CSR is an acceptable term. I would say in the United States it's either CR, corporate responsibility, without the social, or business ethics. But I think the notion of CSR, which I describe in my book, is much bigger than business ethics, which is an important enough subject as it is, and one needs to have some understanding of ethics to talk about corporate responsibility. By the way, I'm an economist by training and a labor economist. So ethics and a lot of this moral discussion and philosophical discussion around ethics, it doesn't sit very easily with me, and I must say I get a bit lost in it. I'm sure your students probably do as well. But certainly, in fact, I read an article in the New York Times, was it yesterday or the day before? We might be able to get hold of it for you, where it said that 75% of business schools in the United States are now dealing with business ethics issues or business ethics courses. It's unbelievable. When I wrote my first book in '95 on corporate social responsibility, I think there was maybe 2 or 3 schools in the whole of the United States worrying about business ethics. You remember the debate at that time about ethical behavior. I think it was the Exxon Valdez incident which led to a whole discussion of business ethics. But since then it's absolutely amazing. To me, being involved in it happily, it's like a wild ride. It's like being a surfer. I'm not a surfer. I'm a skier, but I'm not a surfer. It's like being on a ride with corporate social responsibility being taken on board by companies all over the world. But your question was, and quite a complex question actually, and I'm sorry to give such a long answer, is the differences around the world. Another thing, certainly in the United States, is the United States has always been a big giver in terms of philanthropy. And this goes back hundreds of years to Ford. And I think that notion has kind of driven ideas of corporate responsibility in this country. So it's still essentially philanthropic. Quite often you see the word CSR and philanthropy used in the same breath. Michael Porter does this, for example, I think quite mistakenly. To me,
help us to disentangle those.
Well, yes, I'm just going to do that.
Great.
It's philanthropy, I mean, old-style philanthropy, giving, and not expecting a return. I would say new-style philanthropy is looking at the sustainability of what you give. I suppose it's a bit of a hackneyed expression, but somebody comes up to me and asks me for money for Red Poppy Day, for example. My response after thinking about this quite carefully is that you asked me last year, what happened between then and now? So, I would look much more for sustainability in terms of philanthropic contributions. So I would also think about things like exit strategies, so that when you're involved in an activity of philanthropy, how can you get out of it? Are you doing what the government should be doing? And sometimes is the government using you as an excuse for not being involved in lots of these measures? So I think that a lot more thinking has to be done I think it's starting, but a lot more thinking has to be done in terms of philanthropy, its use and its application. CSR to me is much wider than philanthropy. CSR to me is a systems approach to looking at businesses. Let me just define it briefly. Is that corporate social responsibility is treating the stakeholders of a company responsibly or ethically. So the word ethic does come in that. Mm-hmm. The question then is, who are the stakeholders? The company has stakeholders internally and externally. This has led to a huge debate, of course, both in the literature and also amongst companies themselves. The main stakeholders for a company, the inside ones, are kind of obvious. The managers, the employees, the shareholders, the owners, and so on. And the external ones also reasonably obvious, the consumers and the suppliers. But then if you start adding others, such as the natural environment, this is how I link the notion of corporate social responsibility and environment, because I see natural environment as a stakeholder, an important stakeholder. Government's a stakeholder, media is a stakeholder, and so on. Where does it stop? I don't think we know. We're still discussing these issues.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. You talked about some concerns that you have regarding CSR and/or philanthropic activities on the part of companies, possibly giving room to governments around the world to abdicate their natural responsibilities. Mm. Could you talk a little bit about what you think are the appropriate roles for government, for business, and for civil society in terms of promoting a development agenda?
I think actually it's quite a tough question. I think a lot of us are struggling with that because economies are changing continually, and certainly we've seen in our lifetime the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of communism, when the state was the company. Well, it was all owned by the public authorities and, in a sense, by the people, which was the idea. So not so long ago, that was the idea in one part of the world. In our part of the world, it's a continual discussion. For example, in my country, in Britain, we have a national health service. In the United States, you have Medicare, which is quasi-public, quasi-private. I'm not quite sure, actually. It keeps changing all the time. I know it's a huge weight on the economy, and it will be in the future. Same with the National Health Service in Britain, by the way. By the way, the National Health Service in Britain, I think, is the largest employer in the world. It's over 1 million employees. It's quite interesting. So I think the dividing line between now we're talking about the private sector, not corporations, the dividing line between private and public, I think it's still very much under debate. I think the theorem usually is if the private sector can do it better, then let the private sector do it. But the private sector, of course, is out to make a profit, whereas the public sector, in a sense, is not profit-orientated. It's out to give a service. This is why I think the notion of corporate social responsibility is important, because it now starts to say to corporations, well, we've given you the possibility to run our health service or whatever, or even our education system, but what are your social responsibilities? And I think this is the new wave of this millennium, is that you could say that characterize the last century as one of essentially public intervention, and now the public sector is under pressure. We've given many opportunities to the private sector. So since we've now given the private sector the space, we also need to have a look what they're doing. And I think this is why the notion of corporate social responsibility has risen so rapidly, especially in the last 10 years. As I said, I feel like a surfer the way that it's been taking off. Sorry.
Do you see that that remains important policy obligations for governments in terms of helping to spur enhanced corporate responsibility or enhanced engagement by the private sector?
I think it's an interesting question. What I've seen is that it's very early days for governments to start thinking about the social responsibility of companies. Hardly any government really discusses that. However, in Britain we have a Minister for Corporate Social Responsibility, but pretty ineffective. In other countries in Europe there's some interest at the government level. In the United States, I met somebody yesterday, I think from the State Department, who was Undersecretary for Corporate Social Responsibility and Labor Law, or was it International Development? So I was absolutely amazed. I was actually staggered because, you know, the private sector in the US is, well, leave the things to the private sector and the government gets on and doing what they do, which is, well, sometimes wonder what it is. So, you know, what is the future in terms of, I think governments are still not quite sure where to go, what they should do in terms of CSR. The big companies would like, believe it or not, governments to legislate more, to create a level playing field. The big corporations, for example, take wages. Generally, big corporations in developing countries pay significantly more than other companies in a developing country. So they would be happy to discuss issues of minimum wages, for example, with the government, so that they know where they stand and so that they can't be undercut by another competitor. The thing is, we often talk and think about big corporations, you know, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and so on. And these are the ones that have attracted the attention of activists and interest on corporate social responsibility and done some very interesting things, Shell and BP. ExxonMobil, we can come to that later if you like. Anyway, sorry.
The wage differential issue, I think, is a nice one in highlighting differences between the industrialized world and developing countries in terms of how firms may engage on CSR activities. Can you think of other examples or other ways in which corporate social responsibility either does or perhaps should differ between settings in the developing world and settings in the industrialized world?
That's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about that, to be quite honest. We're really talking now about the whole development debate. Is, you know, should conditions be different in the developing world than in the industrialized world? And the World Trade Organization and the discussions within it have been struggling with this issue. For example, developing countries are very reluctant for the World Trade Organization to include labor laws in trade agreements because they say, hang on, you know, we're poorer than you, we can't possibly afford to include some of these labor laws in our legislation, we would be annihilated. You know, maybe we could phase it in over time. The rich countries say, no, you shouldn't be using labor exploitively, you shouldn't be using child labor and the rest of it. So there's definitely a conflict. And what's happened, in fact? Nothing. It's a kind of stalemate. The World Trade Organization dances around this idea. The International Labour Organization, which is meant to be looking at these sorts of issues, also dances around it. So what happens? So I think corporations actually would like the dance to end in a dignified way and actually to come up with some sort of legislation which they can understand and they know where they are. Because at the moment they sometimes don't know really where they are. They don't know what labour laws to include, which ones not to, and it's kind of, well, it's very fluid, and it also comes to this whole issue of the International Division of Labour itself, which is a huge issue of lower price labour producing goods and taking jobs away from rich countries. Is a huge issue.
I wonder if we could circle back a little bit in thinking about what motivates corporations, and we often describe, at least in business schools, as corporations being profit-seeking entities. And as we think about corporate social responsibility around the world and the motivation of firms to pursue profits, we might recognize that there may be some natural limitations on the definition and the view of development that corporations hold. So they may not hold as broad a perspective on what development might mean as would other actors. And in fact, we've seen that corporations around the world have done terrific work that has positive development implications in a number of countries. But often these initiatives and these efforts either are on a fairly small scale, a localized scale, and or they're subject to the whims of their investors, right, that are looking for profitability kinds of considerations often in their investment decisions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, based on the experiences that you've had in working with companies around the world, about some of the promising things that you've looked at in terms of corporate actions that may be scalable to global proportions to promote a global development agenda, and or some initiatives that are much more consistent with sustainable social and economic development implications that go beyond the perhaps shorter term or more carefully defined profit implications that some corporations tend to pursue.
Yeah, I think perhaps the key word is leverage. Is when you work on a project in a country, are you just doing it in that local area, or do you want to use that as an example to spread around the world? I think the same is true not just of big corporations, also of many NGOs. You call it civil society organizations, you call them now CSOs. See, the problem with NGOs and corporations to a certain extent when they work on development, on very micro projects, is that their intervention is rather spotty. They kind of work near to their factories, or they'll work in a particular area because the government has advised them to do that. And they don't worry too much about scaling that up across the whole country. In fact, let me give a plug for this book, if I may. Thank you very much. In this book, I actually discuss a little bit this issue, and I divide kind of development interventions into three areas, what I call macro, meso, and micro. Micro being small-scale projects, creating an irrigation channel or something. Meso is the channel between the macro policy and the micro. And meso is essentially the institution, the governance issues, but where capacity development is most needed. And the top, of course, macro is the policy space. In fact, most development has to be done in the middle bit. You find that those countries which have got fantastic institutions have done very well in terms of development, which lead to good projects at the time and based on good policy. But this is kind of unsung because you can't see it. You can't see it on CNN. I can't show you it. Whereas I can show you a project at the grassroots level. So that's one of the issues, kind of the macro, meso, micro split. And I've advised companies that I work with to try and work at all three levels. The macro level, of course, is problematic because that's a policy ppe. So the question is, how much should multinationals be involved in policy issues? And in fact, somebody yesterday at the meeting at the Chamber of Commerce, where I gave a short talk, said, and I think it was very good. He said that in English, the English language is a very rich language, and you can distinguish between politics and policy, whereas in many countries you can't. So when you're involved in policy, so you can advise on the exchange rate mechanism, you can advise on labor laws and so on, but you're not taking the decisions, so you're not involved in politics. Of course, big companies are quite powerful. To a certain extent, that can be a huge problem. Turning back to an experience that I saw quite recently. I was fortunate enough to be in Cape Town, in fact, 1 week ago. Beautiful weather, not like the cold here, that's for sure. And I saw a vocational training scheme. A company was paying for a vocational training institute. They were training poor, black, unemployed people in short-term training, quite basic skills, maths to a certain extent, but also care of older people, maids to a certain extent, cooking, and so on. Not high tech, and we can get to the thing is that corporations are training people in developing countries to stay poor by giving them low tech skills. Maybe we can go on to that in a minute. But these skills are needed all over the world. And here was a training school taking people from poor areas and training them and paying them a little bit. And then with a 98% success rate of finding jobs, which is absolutely remarkable. If you go around the world and look at training institutions, in fact, they very rarely look at the demand side. The supply, the education part, which is the supply side, the training side is the supply side. But the demand, which is how do you find a job after that, is looked at, but rarely as consistently as I saw in this training school. So my advice to the suggestion, rather, to the training school was, well, this is fantastic what you're doing. Why don't you get the Department of Labour in South Africa to take up some of these ideas, matching supply and demand? It's almost the holy grail of vocational training. And they said, well, we've tried. But the problem is that the government is quite happy to advise, but rather reluctant to take advice. So a bit stuck. But the thing is, you can unblock that. And because the corporation was big, a big, powerful multinational with good access to government, my suggestion was, well, why don't you open that dialogue with the government to try and find out what the problems are and actually put some of the management practices that you put into that institute into the wider government. Anyway, watch this space. I don't know how far they've got on that. It was just a week ago. So.
It's an interesting example. You talk about the meso level as being an important level, and that's the level at which institutional development occurs. Can you think of some specific things that corporations may do to be effective in helping to build stronger, more robust institutions to promote social and economic development around the world?
Well, training, in a sense, is a meso activity, because you can't really see it, what people get. I really like education and training, because once received, you never lose it. But the sorts of things that the corporations can do, an institution, is management. I mean, corporations are fantastic at management to survive, and they have tremendous skills. So I think they can lend that to governments if government wishes to listen. Quite often the government doesn't want to listen for all sorts of political reasons and influence reasons, all the reasons that we know about. The other thing is that that corporations can do is, there's another thing I saw in South Africa a week ago, which was a free university. In South Africa, dropout rates amongst black students is incredibly high. I heard the figure of 60–70%. This was a free university which had a solid mentoring system. In fact, I saw a bit like the tutoring system at Oxford. I don't know how widespread that is in this country. But the mentors were not essentially professionals. They were people taken from the society. And so that the student could go and talk to their mentor about all sorts of issues, not just the academic issues. And it seemed to be fantastically successful. But this it was called TSIBA, T-S-I-B-A, and there's another one in Johannesburg. TSIBA is in Stellenbosch, and they're also trying to replicate this experience in Pakistan. So this idea of leverage, they're interested in doing that. But the problem with it is a free university getting grants from mainly corporations. When the corporation decides not to give them any more money, what happens to the institution? So we were looking at ways of making it more sustainable, creating a trust fund, for example. It so happened that they had a young man there who'd worked for JP Morgan, an American, who went over as an intern. And I know you're going to ask me this later, is that it's a good way of getting a job is to work as an intern, and then you get experience, and then you're recognized, and then it's a good way of moving into getting a job. So this young man worked with JP Morgan, came to Africa for a year and worked for free. But after 6 months, they liked him so much, they took him on the staff. And now he's trying to set up a trust fund. And so the company I was with, has fantastic financial advisors and financial management. So I said, why don't you guys just get together and see how you can manage this trust fund to try and move to making this institute sustainable. So again, by working on the finance and a trust fund and so on, you can't see anything. It's kind of invisible, but that's the sort of capacity development that companies can get involved in.
Very good. In Washington and throughout the world, the notion of partnership between sectoral actors seems to be quite in vogue. I know our U.S. Agency for International Development is promoting very heavily the involvement of the private sector in development activities abroad, working with civil society actors as well as working with local and national governments. I wonder if you can talk about some of your experiences both on the positive and the negative side with regard to this idea of partnership, and what are some issues that we need to be aware of and thinking about with regard to the relationship between CSR and partnering.
Yeah, this whole issue of public-private partnership is pretty interesting. I mean, one well-known example is the tube system in London. There's an American who ran the New York rapid transit system, who was appointed by Mayor Livingstone to tidy up the English tube system. And the English tube system transports more than any other tube system, transit system we call it, metro system in the world. It's incredibly crowded, it gets incredibly hot, there's no air conditioning, and not only that, per kilometre it's the most expensive transit system in the world. And this is all a result of bringing this chap over from New York, who gets paid an absolute fortune, and he's brought in these sorts of issues. And this was an idea of the London mayor, Ken Livingstone, to have a public-private partnership. And it's an absolute mess, and everybody's criticizing it. They're not always a mess. There's one partnership which you mentioned was that between corporations and NGOs or civil society. Is that NGOs, I guess, if allow me to use the non-governmental organization, I guess it's more the European notion. NGOs in general tend to have two areas. One is the NGO which helps, which invests, and then the NGO which is more a campaigning NGO. So an example of an NGO which helps and invests is the Rockefeller Foundation, which I don't know, must be over 100 years old, based in New York. It's done actually fantastic work in lending for development and research. An NGO which is, I'm not so familiar with ones in the United States right now, a campaigning Greenpeace. So you've heard of Greenpeace. Greenpeace is almost entirely a campaigning NGO for environmental. You see people in little rubber boats going up to big tankers and the rest of it. So it's a campaigning. Now, certainly corporation a little bit nervous of getting into bed with the campaigning NGO, although it is working a little bit. And I know Greenpeace is working with BP, and Greenpeace is amazed the problems that actually a corporation has when it's trying to think about some of these sustainable development issues. And in a way, it's kind of drawn a bit of the venom from Greenpeace, because a lot of things that a campaigning NGO does is sort of done a little bit in ignorance. I mean, there was a famous Brent Spar incident in the North Sea, where Shell were trying to bury an old oil rig in the North Sea, and Greenpeace said, no, it's polluting like mal, it's full of oil and the rest of it. And so in the end, BP had to abandon sinking this oil rig, and but then they had the problem of how to dispose of it. And then they started analyzing the oil rig, and they did it with Greenpeace. And they found out, in fact, there wasn't much pollution in the oil rig, and the best thing to do would have been actually to bury it at sea, because it'd been made a nice reef. It wouldn't have polluted and might have encouraged the fish population. So Greenpeace got a little bit of egg on their face. And I'm not against campaigning NGOs at all. I mean, they're very interesting. An example of one that crosses both, an example of an NGO that actually does development work and is also campaigning is Oxfam. Oxfam is almost in every country around the world, does absolutely brilliant work. Their people understand development, but on the other hand, they're also campaigning against, well, for example, reducing the price of drugs in developing countries and so on. And then I think corporations are happier to work with something like Oxfam than they are with Greenpeace. But what's amazing about corporations is that they're very heterogeneous. Sometimes you see a typical corporation and corporate man as worried about his job and working like hell and exploiting everybody around him or her. But in reality, it's a whole mixture of people. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of people like that. But quite often the people at the top, and certainly in some of the European companies that I've met, well, even the US corporations, look at Bill Gates is a good example of that, is that these people are expanding their horizons. They're actually trying to see how they can put their corporate and their earnings at the service of something positive and good. Which is quite interesting, and what amazes me the more I work in it is how widespread this notion is, how widespread people are interested in actually using the power of a corporation to actually invest in something worthwhile. Absolutely amazing.
Well, you have a unique perspective, not only as a practitioner in CSR, but you're also a business professor. And so I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about what you believe that business schools either can or should be doing better to prepare future managers and leaders.
Wow, big question. Let me just kind of break it down a little bit, is that I think that nothing beats having a specific skill. I think that almost whatever it is, be an expert in Latin, be an expert in Greek architecture, because that is fantastic training, just to actually complete something in great detail. In a sense, become educated in a sense. Sometimes doing business is more kind of an amorphous thing to study. A bit like studying, I guess one can study government and public policy. I must say 10 or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have recommended people to take business courses. But I've changed over time because business schools have changed. The business studies are becoming more of a discipline. But I still think to appreciate a business school, you need to have some basic tools. I mean, you certainly need to know some mathematics. You need to know some statistics. You need to know some, information technology. And you need to know how to write a research report and do analysis. And when you become a CEO of a company, you need to understand it. When you get a whole bunch of graphs thrown at you and so on, you need to see what the problems are, where the research came from, how a household survey was done, and so on. So you need basic methodology. The number of people, I don't know, I used to teach methodology, the number of people who used to avoid my course is boundless. But, well, I think professors can also make methodological courses much more interesting. We did a number of experiments, I won't go into that right now. But the number of people, for example, who say to me that they hate mathematics. I mean, my first degree was in mathematics. And mathematics is not just numbers, it's actually logical thinking. And if you can grasp logical thinking in mathematics, that helps you to start thinking about business and running companies. So I think that grounding is incredibly important. So I would certainly recommend students to really concentrate on a skill, something that they enjoy. Obviously, there's no point in doing a skill you're not interested in. Mathematics, I push a lot because generally it's rather badly taught. Mathematics can be very, very exciting. It actually can be quite fun. I mean, we all like going to Las Vegas. That's mathematics. By the way, I use my mathematics to gamble, and I've been reasonably successful in applying some of that statistical knowledge to gamble. I find it a bit boring. It's much more fun to talk to you about corporate social responsibility.
Very well. Well, we also have in our business classes increasingly students coming from international affairs, from public policy, from development economics. And what kinds of things might we be doing to try to grow that population of students that are traditionally more interested in development questions that maybe historically have not seen an important role for business in promoting development around the world? What kinds of things might we be doing to try to better engage them, to better attract them, to get them better trained in terms of thinking about business and management issues as they relate to development?
And I think you're right. I think that students and people want to do good, and sometimes they might end up doing more harm than good, and that's rather sad to say. I mean, so many students, we call it in Europe gap years, go for a year off to learn about the world. Yeah, wonderful. That's fantastic, and you come back with great experience. A lot of students go and work in schools in developing countries as teachers, and they come back with all sorts of ideas. One of the problems with those sorts of experiences, which are absolutely fantastic and rewarding, is that it doesn't help you to think out of the box. You know, you come back and you've taught in a school and you've taught young kids, and it's incredibly rewarding teaching. There's no question about it, and you want to do more. However, you know, how do you do more? As an educated person, you need to know something about public policy. You need to know how an education ministry works. How do they work with priorities? How do they allocate finances and so on? So I don't think development courses really cover that. They tend to cover issues like rural development, land reform, technology transfer, and so on. But the idea of looking at development, I think there was a famous book by Mark Blaug, actually worked at the World Bank here, just down the road. And the big discussion was development economics any different from economics? And that maybe development economics was not a separate discipline, it was just a poor man's economics. I think that there is a development economics, and I think some of the things that I wrote about in my book about, for example, the micro, meso, macro split. I think you have to know about that in order to see how the work that you're doing can actually best help a country and where you're working.
Presuming that we're able to be successful in getting more students interested, both from the
sure
business side as well as the non-business side, on questions relating to business and development, what kinds of advice can you give to our students regarding their career planning, their career search, thinking about how to gauge the types of organizations that might be a good fit for them professionally if they really are dedicated to promoting economic and social development around the world, and in embracing and being able to utilize the leverage capabilities that private enterprise might bring?
I mean, that's a kind of difficult question. Do you know, I would say every day I get an email from a student asking how they can get involved in either my company or get involved in CSR and so on. To me, it's tremendously rewarding that this question is being asked. I've likened getting a job to a railway system. If you think of 100 tracks, on every track there's a train, right? Well, if you think of that train instead of a train as a project, right? So that project always needs people. You know, that activity needs people. However, if the train's left the station, it doesn't need you. If the train's in the station or still moving along, it doesn't need you. If you come just before the train, it's too late, they've got the people. You come too early, the train's a long way away. But in fact, there are hundreds of tracks, thousands even. So all these things are happening. So try and look for that project where it's just coming to fruition, the time when they're looking for people. And you do that by having a network, by talking to people. There's no substitute, I don't think, for a network. All the internet is actually being incredibly useful for this, I think. I mean, there are a lot of news groups and so on. But I always think when I see a job advertised or suggested on the internet, there's going to be 100 applicants. So, you know, me as a businessman, I think about this all the time because I'm looking at projects. There are projects I want to work in. There's some I don't want to work on. But all the time, you know, which ones can we get? So to find that specific train which is going to accept you and you like, you need a huge radar going around. And also sometimes you need to be a little bit different from your competitors. I mean, if everybody says, you know, I'm a CSR professional, what sort of CSR professional are you? I mean, how can you help us? And I found out in my own work that the general notions of CSR and so on are known by the big corporations. Stakeholder dialogue, for instance, is where companies try and find out from their stakeholders what their main actions could be, what they can learn, and so on. But they get so much information coming in. How do they handle that? They don't know. Some have used the web. Shell has used it with something called Tell Shell, but they had to abandon that. They got too many people, and they got one NGO who totally dominated them with a flood of emails and kind of spoiled it. So how do you handle that? They don't know. So you come up with a new idea in that area, but that's experience. So I would advise any new student, and it's a big problem, is that you need the experience, but of course you can't get a job until you've got the experience. This horrible chicken and egg problem that students face. And I must say, all those students have written to me over the years. I wonder where they all are. I'm sure they've all got something. I mean, the fact they write to me, I'm sure they've written to 100 people, and I would encourage them to do that. So you just have to be very, very active in the labour market, but try and get a specific skill, look different, and also try and get some experience. You know, nothing beats working in a company, and even working as a waiter or a waitress. I mean, I've done that, by the way. I've worked as a waiter, I've worked as a bus conductor, and so on. And it shapes the way that I think you deal with people, and you deal understanding and how a company works. So, unfortunately, nothing beats experience, and it's difficult to get. But you can get experience continually in your local communities, anywhere. And in fact, intelligent people who are peaceful and trying to change the world in a peaceful way, please, are in great demand in any community. You just look outside your house. Look at that old lady 3 doors up who hasn't spoken to anybody for 3 months. I mean, can't you do something there? So that experience would help you to move something forward. Yeah.
Very good. Michael Hopkins, thank you so much for spending time with us this morning and sharing your ideas about the role of business in corporate social responsibility and development around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.